Welcome to the Fix Your Gut podcast. My name is Jason Hooper, and as always, we're here with John Brissom.
Hope everybody is doing well today.
Today, we're going to be talking about Alzheimer's disease. We're going to talk about some of the hypotheses for the causes and some things that you can do to possibly prevent that. And if you are susceptible to Alzheimer's, through your genetics or something, maybe we can give you some tips on how to make that easier for you. So, first of all, Alzheimer's is a terrible disease. It's if you've ever known somebody with Alzheimer's, loved one or somebody, it's just awful to see because their body's still there, but their mind starts to go, and it's probably one of the most terrifying diseases out there. Bill Gates, I think the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation just injected $100 million into Alzheimer's research. And so hopefully we see some.
So I guess because of that, it's not going to go anywhere, huh? Boom. All right, go ahead, Jason.
I don't know. They almost wiped out polio. I mean, last year.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they did.
There was only 3 documented cases of polio, I think, and they were like all in Afghanistan. So I don't know. I think they're doing some good things.
I disagree politely, but go ahead, Jason.
Well, $100 million is quite a bit of cash for research, so we might be seeing some innovations. So the hypothesis that was prevailing for a long time was the amyloid beta precursor proteins, and so I guess basically like what everything, I guess, that we attribute to Alzheimer's, or not everything, but when we start looking at cause, what happens is somebody has Alzheimer's, they pass away, and then they do the autopsy, and they start looking at the brain, and they see what's there that's not supposed. They start seeing stuff that's there that's not supposed to be, like aluminum, and we'll talk about that later. But then they start seeing like some strange protein buildup, like amyloid beta. Amyloid beta is a membrane protein. We're not really even sure what it does, but with the amyloid beta protein, it's supposed to like lie in sheets when it's in its normal state, but it's a 40 protein. It's a 40 amino acid chain peptide, and when it's encoded incorrectly, it doesn't lie flat anymore. It's got kinks in it, and then it starts to create buildup, and you basically have amyloid plaque in the brain, and that's not good. And that can cut off blood flow and create lots of problems. And so the theory was that something would happen to change the way you transcoded APP, which is the amyloid precursor protein, and then all of a sudden you'd get a bunch of plaque, and then that would lead to Alzheimer's. Now, there are people listening to this podcast right now that have this issue, and they don't even know it. They don't have any symptoms. And they may never, ever have any symptoms. And the treatments that they've had for this, they've developed different medications and different therapies that have targeted these genes, and they've seen zero benefits to the medication. So they're starting to think that this probably isn't what's causing Alzheimer's. This is probably just, okay, we see this happening in Alzheimer's patients, but it may not be a cause. It may just be a side effect or something. But the interventions haven't been working, and they've done some. They've also done some. Well, it's gone all the way into phase 3 trials, and all the to my knowledge, all of the phase 3 trials right now have been discontinued because they haven't been seeing any results. And so they've done studies and like roundworms and stuff, trying to do knockouts and to where they they don't produce any amyloid precursor proteins and see what happens. And it just doesn't seem to have any effect. So that hypothesis is pretty much dead. The next prevailing hypothesis is something called has to do with something called tau proteins, and it's a similar thing to this APP, amyloid precursor proteins, to where we've got these proteins that are encoded incorrectly, and there's either a transcription problem, and then all of a sudden they have these weirdly shaped structures, and they don't function correctly. Now, with the tau proteins, we do kind of have an idea about what they do. They tend to work in the axons, and they're tubular proteins, so they help with the transmission of neurons, right?
But one thing about amyloid proteins, real quick, isn't it the issue that they're seeing with them being folded, similar to pyron proteins?
Correct. Yeah. Well, they're supposed to lie flat, right? They're supposed to be beta sheets. Okay. So if you don't know anything about proteins, let me try to break this down. So there are different shapes that proteins can make. There can be spirals, there can be sheets, they depending upon. Okay, so you have these amino acids and they're all linked together. And that's what a protein is. And each amino acid has a different chemical charge, and they can attract each other or repel each other. And that's it's kind of like magnets. And so they take on certain shapes based on their chemical charge and, some other factors too, whether they're hydrophilic, hydrophobic. There's a lot of different chemical forces that determine the shape of proteins. And these amyloid beta is supposed to be beta, it's supposed to be these beta sheets. So they're supposed to be flat. And in the middle of the peptide, there is a transcription error, or actually the DNA actually changes entirely, believe it or not. And where you're just making these things every time with one of the amino acids is wrong. And so they don't lie flat anymore. They kind of, they just coagulate, they just kind of like, I don't know, they're not stacked and organized like they're supposed to be. So it looked as if that's what the problem with Alzheimer's was. And they tried to target this and they tried to study this more. Everything has led to a dead end. So it's probably not what's going on. So then we start looking at the tau proteins. And the tau proteins, again, they help with the transmission of neurotransmitters. They help, they're like tubular proteins. So they help those things fire correctly and make it to the right place. They're primarily located in the central nervous system, and then again we got this issue where the tau proteins aren't being transcribed correctly, and so now we have the tau hypothesis. So we have this abnormal phosphorylation. You have this enzyme called kinase, which attaches a phosphorus to something in a protein. And so we have this excessive phosphorylation. And so what's happening is that you just get a buildup of a lot of tau. And so that's where the research is heading this way. They're starting to look at this and seeing if these microtubes associated with the tau protein 1 are the cause. As I'm looking at this research, and I have nothing to base this on other than when I look at the amyloid precursor protein research, it looks identical as far as like, oh, we're sure this is the case. We see this change, and we're going to start making medications to regulate it, and like everything's looks like it's pointing this direction. But I think once they start the trials, they're going to figure out that this is also not going to do anything as far as, whatever they do as far as alternative splicing or whatever. They can start manipulating the gene, which is on chromosome 17. They start playing around with it, and they're probably going to find that it's like it is a result of somebody having Alzheimer's, but it's not necessarily the cause of Alzheimer's. It did through this research, though. It's not a complete waste because as they were looking at, they're saying like, why are these genes not functioning correctly? Like all of a sudden you have a gene that just completely changes. It's encoding a different protein than it was before. How does that happen? That's kind of weird. And then we started looking at viruses. And then we said, well, you get some kind of a virus that comes in and changes the way, it basically changes a gene entirely. So that's interesting research, and I'm curious to see where that leads.
No, I could talk about that, Jason. That's what I was going to talk about.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, with one more stat before I let you go is that there's an interesting correlation between Alzheimer's and herpes simplex 1, which is a virus that I think something like half the population has by the time they're 30 or something. I don't know the exact stat on that, but a lot of people have it. And there is a high correlation between people that have herpes simplex 1 and people that have Alzheimer's. So maybe somehow that virus is affecting the way those, or somehow changing those genes to where they're transcribing different proteins. We don't really know. But I'll let you talk about.
Well, we do know there's a lot of studies now that are showing that to be the case.
Yeah.
So they've looked at herpes simplex 1 as possibly being a cause of Alzheimer's disease, even as far back as the 1980s. And they couldn't at first prove that viral infections, specifically herpes simplex 1, or the herpes viridae virus, were able to cross the blood-brain barrier and cause latent viral infections of the brain. But that was later discovered in 1991 when many elderly people actually had a very high amount of herpes simplex 1 DNA within their brains. And so usually the herpes simplex virus, like any herpes viridae virus, you don't get rid of it. It's not like the cold, the common cold. Your immune system defeats the rhinovirus within a week or so, and you're over it and you're fine. Herpes viridae viruses, majority of them, once the body inactivates them, they lie dormant within the cranial nerve system, mainly the trigeminal nerve for majority of them, where they lie dormant there. And they become reactivated when the immune system is not able to keep them in check. Over time, sometimes it could be a period of stress. Sometimes it can be you get in a car accident and physical stress. Some medications that damper immune function can also cause it as well. So with the reactivation of these viruses, when they don't lay dormant, they can travel up the vagus nerve, and if the blood-brain barrier is weakened, as it does as you get older, it's able to cross into the brain and it can lie dormant. So I'm going to read a little bit from, real quick, of just a few lines from a paper on it that was published in 2014. Active HSV1 infection causes severe damage and usually leads to cell death. It was therefore suggested that HSV1 might periodically reactivate in the brain during episodes of stress, immunosuppression, or inflammation, causing cumulative, though unnecessary, limited, and localized damage, what is greater in APOE4 characters, which we'll talk about APOE later, leading eventually to the development of Alzheimer's disease. Reactivation events have long been known to occur in the peripheral nervous system, where HSV1 resides lifelong in the trigeminal ganglia. They cause overt damage in the form of cold sores, and some 20 to 40% of those effective, while others remain asymptomatic, an enigma solved by the work in the author's laboratory. So it appears that, like most quote-unquote autoimmune conditions where the body just decides to attack itself, or in the case of Alzheimer's disease where epigenetic changes are seen on the genetic level by said virus, most of your autoimmune conditions are triggered by some sort of pathogen. And in this case, it would be that Alzheimer's disease is a current reactivation of herpes simplex 1 within the brain, similar to how schizophrenia is caused by T. gondii within the brain, a latent infection as well. So you got anything to add to that, Jason?
Yeah. So
or anything?
What they're finding in the brain is the RNA of the the viruses. And it's like I said, you look at the autopsy and you're like, oh, this is here. This might not supposed to be here, but that doesn't mean that's what it's necessarily causing it. Because look, check this out. Like I said,
you're also finding a high amount of them within the amyloid plaques and tau plaques as well. I want to make note of that.
Sure, absolutely. Like, look, with APP, like I said, there's people right now listening to this that have APP. Don't freak out and be like, I'm going to get Alzheimer's. Not necessarily. Okay. There's people right now listening to this that have herpes simplex 1, and try getting rid of that. Good luck.
Well, you can't, but you can inactivate it. Like if you have herpes simplex 1 and APO4, you probably want to do your best to make sure that herpes varidae reactivation rarely ever occurs.
Right. So I guess get on your Valtrex,
or have get proper sunlight exposure for vitamin D production, as well as a heavier lysine, low arginine diet combined with the supplement PQQ. But we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah. The amino acid. Yeah. It seems that the herpes virus does really well with a lot of arginine, right? And then it seems to not do so well with a high concentration of lysine.
Yes.
And so there seems to be some dietary ways to control it. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that you've got all these things, but you've got babies that have herpes simplex 1. I don't really know how that happens. I guess like if you've got herpes, like don't kiss your baby on the mouth. Like why would you do that? I don't know. I don't understand.
There's been babies who have died from that.
Yeah, I mean that's how most people get it though. They get it when they're a baby and somebody kissed them on the mouth. I don't understand why you.
Or they can get it as a teenager and they drink from somebody with an active cold sore. Yeah. You kiss your lover who has an active cold sore and then you end up getting it.
Well, the herpes simplex got so bad actually in the Roman Empire that they banned kissing entirely. I don't know. That's just a little fun fact there. But so we're getting off track here. But my point is, like, you've got people with different transcription problems. You've got people with different viruses. They don't have any symptoms of Alzheimer's. Okay, and now Alzheimer's. There's like early onset Alzheimer's, but what's the youngest case of Alzheimer's you've ever seen?
I think in the 40s, right?
Yeah, I mean, so it's basically a disease for the elderly. So if you start looking at the gene cascades and the pathways that are connecting amyloid beta and tau, and you've explored the literature that finds connections.
Okay, the youngest is actually, I apologize, 27.
Oh my gosh, that's kind of crazy. There might be other conditions too. There might be like head trauma or something, but.
And also remember, Alzheimer's and Down syndrome both affect chromosome 21. And many patients, with Down syndrome, if they live long enough, eventually develop Alzheimer's disease too.
I did not know that. Okay, so you start looking at the genes surrounding amyloid beta and tau. And you start to see, with tau, you start to see strong connections between some genes that are not expressed as much as we age. For instance, superoxide dismutase, collagen, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor 1, the overexpression of interleukin 6, IL-6, and TNF. So with tau, you get these like aging hormone cascades, just these genes that just don't express as much as you do, or some are expressed more as you get older. And then with amyloid beta, you see some genes that are associated with that. They're in the same cascade that have some cognitive function, right? Like BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, acetylcholine integrase. These are some genes that are responsible for creating neuroplasticity. Acetylcholine is a very important neurotransmitter. But every single thing,
which used to be one of the hypotheses for Alzheimer's disease, was the acetylcholine, the cholerogenic
right?
hypothesis.
But if you look at a map, like if you just start mapping out these genes, these gene cascades, and you start mapping out, like what do they have in common? Where does the amyloid beta gene cascade intersect the tau protein genetic cascade? And it seems to be ApoE, as you mentioned earlier. That's the gene that's in common between the
specifically
two.
Specifically APO4.
So yeah, so that there's different variations of the apolipoprotein. And basically what this protein does is it's a receptor that allows low density lipoproteins to connect and basically dispense lipids to the area to be metabolized, right? So you have LDL and HDL. Well, LDL, it needs to connect to something. LDL is like a bus, and it transports stuff. It transports triglycerides back to the liver. And so with the different variations...
transport cholesterol to the neurons in the brain.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, yes. And so we have these variations. We have basically there are three. There's what we would typically call as the wild type, or like what most people have, and then we have in people, we call them polymorphisms, which are changes in the gene with three different alleles. E2, E3, and E4. Now, E4 has E2 and E4 seem to be really bad. E3 seems to be pretty good. And if you get your 23andMe thing done, you'll see you can see which variation you have. I'm fortunate to have the E3 variant, so I'm good to go. But E2 seems to be correlated with stuff like Parkinson's disease and
arteriosclerosis. Same with E4.
Yeah. That's right. And hyperproteolemia, which is like vascular disease. So that's not a good deal. And E4,
there's no positive with E2. There is one positive with E4. Is E4 tends to have higher levels of vitamin D.
Yeah, but yeah, people with E4 tend to have like accelerated telomere shortening and sleep apnea, and they tend to not recover as fast from brain injuries. Reduce cognitive function. So if you've got E4, there, and again, like just because you've got
faster disease progress of multiple sclerosis.
Yeah, and I had a client once that had the E4 variant, and basically, wanted some support there because she was just terrified. She thought that was a death sentence or whatever, and it's really not. And there are a lot of things you can do, to help yourself out. So it's just because you have the E4 variant doesn't mean you're going to get Alzheimer's. It just means that you have an increased risk for that, and there are ways to decrease your risk even more than your genetics will indicate.
Is it because APO, one of the other things that it does is it helps to proteolytic break down the amyloid protein?
Well,
and in doing so, people without variants tend to have a better mechanism of breaking down those proteins properly?
That would fall under the APP hypothesis. I'm not sure. I'm not really sure 100%.
Well, beta amyloid peptide, not
right. It would. Right, amyloid peptide beta. It would seem that makes sense, but again, we don't know cause or effect. Maybe that's just an effect of Alzheimer's and not necessarily the cause.
What about the old hypothesis that the brain develops type 3 diabetes? I've heard that's been tied in with APO4 too as well, because APO4 also deals with glucose metabolism too.
Yes. Well, that's also actually, that's one of the things that I didn't mention with amyloid beta is that amyloid beta is also associated with insulin production in the brain. And so, when when amyloid beta is not functioning correctly, then the insulin production isn't functioning correctly, and so because like it's a membrane protein, right? So you're going to have less insulin in the brain, and that's not good. So that and having insulin, insulin by itself can be nootropic as well. I mean, I definitely wouldn't recommend this, but the people that are biohackers or whatever that are out there trying to get a few more IQ points by engaging in risky behaviors, there's a popular thing to do where they go to the drugstore and they can just buy insulin. I don't think you need it. I don't think you need a prescription for it. I think you can just buy it, and they put it in one of those nasal spray machines, and they just basically, like those nasal saline sprays. Yeah, and they just spray it in their nose and inhale, and they get a shot of insulin to the brain, and then that makes them. That enhances their cognition. Again, don't recommend this. I've never done this before. I would never do this, but it's something that some people do. The people that are like on, I don't know, what's that form, like longevity or whatever?
Yeah, doing biohacking. It's just much safer stuff that you can do to get improved cognitive function than spraying insulin into your nose.
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. There's a guy. Well, I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole. I just don't know. I'm not going to try it myself because it seems pretty risky, messing with your hormones like that. Some people think it's pretty safe and they're doing it for a while. There's just no long-term studies yet. So I'm just going to let them do that for a while and see. And if it turns out to be totally safe, well, then I'll change my opinion. But right now, I put it as a pretty high risk.
So we do know that APOE, especially APOE2 and possibly APOE4, can lead to issues can lead to the development of diabetes and the worsening of diabetes symptoms like diabetic neuropathy. So there does seem to be a correlation with those two as well, and the correlation with Alzheimer's disease too, which used to be possibly before the herpes viridae hypothesis, which I actually think is probably the most sound one and the one they're actually doing the most research into now. It would appear that the previous one of type 3 diabetes, again, seems to be a consequence, not a cause.
Well, like correlation does not necessarily mean causation, right? So we just don't know. It's, we just don't know yet. And until, you can have these, you can have research to where everything looks good. It's all laid out. And then all of a sudden you do an in vivo study, a real life study, and it just doesn't play out the way you thought it would. And so not only do we have to see, the correlation, but we have to find a mechanism, we have to see it in action, and that we don't have yet. And so that's, kind of what we have to, work out.
Yeah, we'll talk about later on things that possibly could be done as far as the prevention of Alzheimer's disease, and possibly maybe things that can be done when a person actually has Alzheimer's disease to slow the condition. But there are things that possibility you can do to address all of these things for a better outcome.
Yeah, for sure. And look, when it comes to scientific research, when it comes to drugs, supplements, whatever, there are people that tend to be more naturally skeptical, and there are people that tend to be more accepting. And so, I tend to fall more on the skeptical side of the spectrum. Like, I tend to want to see more evidence before I confirm it. And then some people tend to be more optimistic about it, and they say, oh, we should be doing all this stuff. And this is usually people where you look in their medicine cabinets and they got like $500-$600 worth of supplements there. And that's great. Good for them. But that's what makes the world go round. And for me, I'm very wary of anybody who says, oh, we figured out, we figured out what causes Alzheimer's. It's like, oh, you did, huh? I just want to wait and see, more data first before I hop on board with anything.
I somewhat disagree with that. I think the herpes viridae hypothesis is probably the most correct one, just through my study of the immune system and the study of majority of autoimmune conditions being pathogen related. And so when someone has Alzheimer's disease, you could try these things, or even prevention of Alzheimer's disease, to try certain things. If you do have herpes simplex 1, it's not going to hurt you in the long run. I mean, if anything, you don't want HSV1 reactivation to be constantly occurring, do you, Jason?
No, that's not going to be good. But let me just mention this though. Do you know anybody, or have there ever been cases of people who have had Alzheimer's disease that didn't have the herpes viridae virus?
From what I've seen in the studies, it's been very, very, very low.
Okay, so if you let's say it's as high as 80% of people with Alzheimer's also have herpes simplex 1.
That would be probably correct, yes.
So then what about the other 20%? How did they get it?
We don't, I mean, that would be data I haven't seen. From what I've seen from the studies, pretty much everybody has it to some degree, or has some sort of herpes viridae virus that may not necessarily be HSV1. And because it's ubiquitous in nature, it seems to be, it may not be just HSV1 in of itself. It could be the herpes viridae genus that's causing it. And so since it is, it could be Epstein-Barr, it could be cytomegalovirus, it could be herpes simplex 2. It just seems to be the one that's strongly correlated. But it's like MS. MS seems to be strongly correlated with both the herpes viridae genus of viruses, as well as H. pylori. So there could be other agents. I mean, there's been fungal agents that could be co-infections that are implicated in Alzheimer's disease as well. But I still think the herpes simplex virus 1 hypothesis is one of the most strongest. I mean, you see it in elderly brains where it's not really there so much in the brains of younger people. And that could be exactly like you said, the immune system, you have less cytokines, you have less defense, therefore a more porous blood-brain barrier. So therefore it tends to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. There's been correlations between APOE polymorphisms, especially APOE4, and the ability of HSV to cross the blood-brain barrier more efficiently in people with those polymorphisms. There's been studies to show that too as well. And also HSV being highly concentrated within amyloid plaque and tau plaque masses, which of course the hypothesis to that is the body tries to produce more of those proteins to try to inhibit the herpes viridae from becoming reactivated. And in doing so, because of changes of epigenetics, it changes the way the proteins are folded, and it starts becoming formation of plaques, which appears to be another tie-in with all of that. Now, remember the aluminum hypothesis used to be another hypothesis for Alzheimer's as well. Well, it just appears that the blood-brain barrier is more porous, like it is seen in viral infections. If you're dealing with a viral infection, when most of these herpes viridae viruses are reactivated, they go up the trigeminal nerve. That's been proven. I've had it happen to myself with reactivation of varicella. It can go into the brain, and when that happens, the thing is when most people think of brain infections of viruses, they think of rabies, which is it's very quick. It's a very chronic disease of the brain, where there are some brain dysbiosis changes, whether it's toxic plasmosis gondii, which takes 10 to 20 years for it to start causing issues within the brain. It lies dormant for a very long time. Children will get them, they can even get it when they're in their mother's womb, and it doesn't affect if they are not aborted from that, and it doesn't affect them until they're 25 if they have certain genes like a COMT polymorphism. And that's also why its infection may affect males more than females, because females have a natural defense against T. gondii, where males do not, which might be why there's way more male schizophrenics. So it's the same with this. The HSV, it either crosses the blood-brain barrier in someone because they're elderly and they have less defense to it through multiple reasons, why. Lack of vitamin D, lack of sunlight exposure, epigenetical changes due to age. I mean, there's many different reasons why that may be. Or it could be that it happens earlier in life and it just lies dormant until the immune system cannot handle it anymore, and it starts causing, localized dysbiosis and infections. The body combats. There's damage that's involved in from that, and so on and so forth. So to me, the HSV1 seems to be the most likely cause. Now, you're correct. It may not be. 10 years from now, we might not that it's just another symptom. It's not the cause. But a lot of data points to it being the cause. And if I had HSV1 and APO4, you darn right there's a few things that I would do to try to prevent me from getting Alzheimer's disease to combat both of those issues.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you have, well, just like if you have polymorphism, like let's say you're a female who has a polymorphism with the BRCA gene, then yeah, you would probably want to do something about that as well, right? So, just reducing your risk would make a lot of sense. And you'd want to do everything you could to prevent that. But it's not necessarily going to happen because you have that genetic variant.
Yes.
So, you just got to play the odds a little bit better, I suppose, because there's a lot of people that have APO4 that will never get Alzheimer's. So
there's people with HSV1 that will never get Alzheimer's as well. But if you have the perfect storm, possibly, of a depressed immune system, HSV1 and APOE4, then yes, you do have a greater chance of developing Alzheimer's
statistically
disease.
Yeah,
at least per the research. Yes.
Well, the thing is, like, I'm not sure statistically if we can apply it that way, because like okay, so let's say like 20% of the population has this and 30% of the population has that, but then they don't necessarily stack upon each other. So it's, if you have this and this, it doesn't necessarily increase your risk that much more. It just individually, statistically, yes, over a large population. But when you're looking at people individually, they may or may not have an issue. I don't know. You see what I'm trying to say?
I agree, but if I had APOE4 and had herpes simplex 1 at one time of my life, or tested positive for high, IgG markers to herpes simplex 1, then I would definitely consider working on both of those the best I could to prevent Alzheimer's disease. You're safer doing that than not doing it, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, a lot of the things that that you should be doing to prevent Alzheimer's, you should be doing anyway. It's for a lot of these things, having good diet, good lifestyle, like it's just something that you should be doing. It's going to prevent all sorts of illnesses, not just Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's just happens to be one of the scarier things that can have happen to you. So it gets more attention as a result. But yeah, I mean, you just kind of have to be careful. Or I guess you just kind of have to be smart about how you live your life.
And one thing I just want to mention too is there are antiviral studies with dementia in the elderly that have been done in the past couple of years, and their dementia scores actually do improve when they're on antivirals. So, and again, that's another correlation that doesn't equal causation, but again, it's the same with COX-2 inhibitors, since COX-2 inhibition has anti-herpes varidae potential. People who are also taking NSAIDs, which in of themselves we're not really a fan of, actually seem to also do better on mental cognition scores, especially people with dementia.
Yeah. COX-2 inhibitors do a really good job of reducing inflammation. These are compounds, like ibuprofen, acetaminophen, Tylenol, that kind of stuff. But they're all also very hard on the gut. Tylenol's hard on the liver, and it's not a good long-term solution for inflammation management.
Curcumin is probably a better selective COX-2 inhibitor, in my opinion.
Sure. The deal is with curcumin. Curcumin is a compound found in the root of the turmeric plant, and it's very good for inflammation reduction. The problem is it doesn't survive well in the gut. Stomach acid breaks it down at a pretty high rate. So they have a liposomal form of curcumin, Minerva SR. A lot of different supplement companies sell it, and it's a lot more expensive than your typical curcumin product, products out there. But I think in that case, it's worth it to have phosphorylated product, using using a means of getting it through the gut without having it break down, I think is really important. Otherwise, you're kind of wasting money, I think. But yeah, curcumin works well. There's a lot of good antioxidants. ALA, I think would be pretty good,
as long as a person doesn't have any mercury amalgams in their mouth or mercury burden. But yes, it would. RLA would definitely help. As a very strong. What about ubiquinol? PQQ has been shown to inhibit herpes viridae within the brain. That's another. PQQ is relatively harmless.
Yeah, I would say so. It's found in diet. I don't see any problem with taking PQQ. I can't think of a case where somebody wouldn't want to take it, other than it's expensive. But yeah.
So why don't we start talking about I want to read one statement, one quick statement, and then why don't we start talking about things that people can do for Alzheimer's prevention? Mm-hmm. We covered pretty much all the known hypotheses, causes of it, right?
Well, the big ones, yeah, I would say. I don't know. There are definitely others out there, and they might be right. Who knows? But I think we covered the major ones.
And aluminum does seem to be a side effect too, as well, of its accumulation in the plaques. Correct? Of a more porous blood-brain barrier.
Well, so if you look at SOD, superoxide dismutase, and you look at the reduction of the superoxide. Okay, so I could really go down a rabbit hole with this, but I completely disagree with with what most people are thinking about with aluminum and Alzheimer's. I think what's basically happening is that when you start to suffer from Alzheimer's, that part of the brain becomes hypoxic, which means there's not enough oxygen in the area. And there is, there's basically, there's two different types of oxygen, O2. Okay, so there's the superoxide, which has an extra, it carries a negative charge because it has an extra electron. And then there's just dioxygen, which is like the stuff in the air that we breathe. In either case, with the lack of superoxide, and probably the lack of oxygen too, because of decreased blood flow, you end up with a hypoxic environment. Now, what happens, when you have a hypoxic environment?
Now you're starting to talk about the mitochondrial theory of
right.
of Alzheimer's being from poorly functional neural mitochondria, because our mitochondria produce superoxide, which greatly increases when there's issues with the electron transport chain and leakage and oxidative stress.
Having that extra electron with superoxide would seem like it would be an antioxidant, right? But it actually turns out that it's a free radical. And if you take any pathogen,
a very potent one at that,
yeah. And if you take any pathogen and you remove its ability to create superoxide, it's no longer virulent. So it's like completely inert. It can't harm you. So that's an interesting feature. But another thing is that if you we have this superoxide dismutase, which can take superoxide and convert it into hydrogen peroxide. So H2O2, which is going to reduce that harm but it can also go back and forth. But anyway, the reason why you're seeing the aluminum residue is because aluminum, when you have like, let's say, so my grandfather's a master welder, and if he's welding with aluminum, a lot of these sports cars and stuff now have aluminum chassis because it's so light, but it's really hard to work on because if you're trying to weld aluminum and there's oxygen in the air, it completely vaporizes because binds to the oxygen, it's gone. So if you're working with aluminum, you have to work on an oxygen-free environment, which is kind of tricky because you got to breathe. And so that's kind of what's going on in the brain. People are, they're not looking at live brains here. They're not like, oh, you have Alzheimer's. Can we dig into your head? So they've already died. And now we're looking at their brain, and we have hypoxic areas of the brain where the Alzheimer's seems to be taking hold. And we look in that area, and it's like, oh, there's all this aluminum there. Well, of course, there's aluminum there because there's no oxygen. And that's just where it's deposited, right? So that's why I think the aluminum hypothesis is, or just basically even considering aluminum at all is just basically another way of saying that the area is hypoxic, and there's nothing really more that you should glean from that.
Which can also be, produced from oxidative stress of the mitochondria through failing of the electron transport chain through either production of reactive oxygen species, which is ROS, like you mentioned earlier, or reaction nitrogen species, which are even more potent than superoxide.
Yeah.
But yes, that would lead to inflammation and cellular death and mitochondrial, death within the brain, which would cause, many symptoms of Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline. Right,
for sure. And, a reduction in the expression of other genes, like it takes energy to fold and unfold proteins. It takes energy to bind certain compounds together with enzymes and stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's if you don't have a lot of ATP production, then it's probably not going to work out for you. But yeah, I still think that the aluminum, you can go into all this biochemistry and physiology of the brain, and basically however you spin it, it's like, why is the aluminum there? It's there because there's no oxygen, period. And you can keep going down that hole, but it all leads to the same answer, which is there's no oxygen here. And that's why there's aluminum. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got to say about that.
Yeah, and also when you have if you have lower levels of amyloid beta that's properly laid flat within the brain, you end up with, if I remember correctly, almost hypoxia, like you mentioned earlier, and also issues with mitochondrial function as far as redox potential and calcium homeostasis, which will cause issues with the mitochondria within the brain. Because, like you said, the curious thing about amyloid beta is that it does appear to be neurotrophic. When you have higher levels, but when you have lower incomplete levels, it tends to cause issues with the brain in and of itself. So,
well, it's related to these neurotropic growth factors, NGF, but
so normal proper produced levels that aren't folded or would be neurotropic, and improper folded proteins would be more, and lower levels would be more neurotrophic, in that it would hurt the brain, right?
Well, when you're looking at any genetic cascade, you got to look at it as a system, okay, and not just point to one thing and say, well, this is the problem, this is the bad guy right here, because clearly there's a lot of other things going on. So we start to see some associations, but maybe it's the amyloid beta is causing problems because you're secreting less neurogrowth factor, as we get older, we produce less and less of that, so that would make sense. We age and we don't express as much of some of these compounds, and then all of a sudden we have cognitive dysfunction. So I don't know.
And one last thing, Jason, and we'll move on, is amyloid beta does have an antimicrobial activity against herpes simplex 1.
The yes, it does in its traditional beta sheet. But
yes, it would.
Yeah, but the abnormal production, proliferation, conjugation of the amyloid beta, it does not have the same effect, for sure. So that also may be, you might be seeing that, and then you see the proliferation of you do your PCR and you see your proliferation of herpes simplex RNA, and you're like, wow, there's just a lot of herpes RNA in this brain. Maybe it's because the amyloid beta failed first. You never know. It might not be the virus that happened first, that was the cause. It might be the protein that broke down, and then why did the protein break down? So that you just got to backtrack and figure out what exactly is going on. And in my opinion, we're just not there yet. Like, we've got some good ideas and we've got some leads, but we don't have a complete picture, in my opinion, of exactly what's going on and really how to solve it.
So what are our recommendations for someone who has APOE4 or has herpes simplex 1 or has Alzheimer's disease that runs in their family? What could be done?
If they have Alzheimer's disease that runs in their family, I don't consider that to be a risk. If they have, some of the risk factors, well, let's look at the big stuff first, okay? So let's just look at lifestyle. You need to be getting good sleep, okay? A lot of these hormones that are produced that seem to be lacking in people with Alzheimer's disease, they're produced while you're sleeping, like growth factor, insulin-like growth hormone, some of the, actually, like while you're sleeping, this is an interesting thing. While you're sleeping, your brain actually swells up a little bit. And there's a little extra water that gets into your brain, and your brain swells while you're sleeping. It kind of does that to help clean stuff out and help good nutrients come in. And it only takes place while you're sleeping. It's not happening while you're awake. So make sure that you get good sleep. You have a good circadian rhythm so that your hormones are in good shape, because there's some association there between hormone expression and cognitive decline. And then, you also want to make sure that you're getting good exercise. Okay. You're physically active, because again, if you're not physically active, then you underexpress certain hormones that also lead to cognitive decline. Primarily the function of the nervous system isn't for cognition. It's not to think up good ideas and remember things and all that stuff. The primary responsibility of the nervous system is to control motion. The CNS does a lot of movement, some voluntary functions, involuntary functions, the ANS, CNS, all that kind of good stuff. But you need to move. You need to get out there and you need to move, and you need to have some kind of physical activity. Resistance training seems to have a very positive effect on hormone expression. So if you're able to do any kind of resistance training, get into a gym, make sure that you have a coach that's showing you how to do the movements correctly so that you don't hurt yourself, and make sure you have a good coach that actually knows what they're doing, and they're not putting you on some kind of crazy thing that's gonna hurt you, and that you can kind of ease into it. And because when you're first starting off, you don't need to go crazy. You just need enough to get going, and then as you progress, you can kind of up the volume a little bit. But yeah, so sleep, physical activity, diet is a key. And especially with fatty acids, it seems to be that you need to be making sure that you have good sources of saturated fat,
grass-fed meats, grass-fed butter.
Sure, or just just butyric acid's very important in my opinion. A lot of that's made in the gut too. So you need a lot of leafy greens and you need a lot of stuff because the majority of the butyric acid that we're getting is actually made in the gut. So make sure that you've got, right, yes. Make sure you got good gut function.
Defeat the colonocytes. But that help prevent against leaky gut. But diet, you want to make sure that you're getting a good amount of omega-3 fatty acid ingestion too through proper seafood. And I got a blog on that I'll link in the show notes on about omega-3s, which also proper omega-3 ingestion reduces inflammation, improves cognitive function as well.
For sure. Omega-3 is important. Eat seafood, fish, whatever. If you're vegetarian, vegan, there are good algae sources of omega-3s that you can use that didn't exist, a while back. It's a relatively new thing. So if you're on a plant-based diet, it's easier than ever to get your omega-3s. Just make sure you supplement with that appropriately because, you really need that in the brain.
What about proper sunlight exposure for circadian rhythm and reduce inflammation, right, as well as to improve vitamin D production?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's not, like I passed by this poster the other day that says like, don't go out in the sun. You get enough vitamin D from your breakfast cereal in the morning. Okay.
No, you don't. And depending on polymorphisms of VDR, ingestion of vitamin D may not convert as well or may not be stored properly within the liver. So,
well, yeah, I mean, you're getting from breakfast cereals, you're probably getting the D2 variant of caffesterol, but the only way to get sulfonated hydroxycaffesterol is through sunlight exposure. That's the only way to get it. So you can have stores of vitamin D, but to make it active, you do need some ultraviolet radiation to your skin. And it's not even really that your skin is doing it. It's the microorganisms that live on your skin, the yeast and so forth that live on your skin that's taking care of this for you. So that's why you need to go out in the sun and get that exposure so that the yeast on your skin can help convert that to a bioavailable form. But yeah, that's very important.
Blocking blue light at night. Maybe if you're working in an office under fluorescent lighting, you might want to wear some blue light blocking glasses.
Yeah.
All that's also going to have effect on cognitive function and the health of your mitochondria as well. And of course, something me and Jason may disagree on is non-native EMF exposure too as well. Like you don't want to live right next to a cell phone tower. And you want to try to limit as much as your non-native EMF exposure as you can. And you can't, not everyone's going to be able to do the things that Jack Kruse recommends. But there are certain things you can do, like turn your Bluetooth off your phone when you're not using it, or your mobile data when you're not using it, and use hardwire instead of Wi-Fi when all possible within your house, or at least turn off your Wi-Fi at night. Stuff like that may also help too as well. Reduce any mitochondrial oxidative stress or weakening your immune system to allow the herpes viridae, if that hypothesis is correct, to reactivate.
Yeah, that dude cracks me up. He's like, all right, don't be around any radio waves, and blue light, and he works as a surgeon in a hospital, right? So like surgeons are under like the brightest lights you can buy. And he's working in a hospital where they have Wi-Fi out your ears.
Now, Jason, he has the redox potential to be able to do that. So.
Well, it's just a little hypocritical. But it's like, hey, you've got to stay away from this. Move to the...
That is one of my main concerns about the cult of Kruse, as they say, is for him to be like, you need to go live like in the jungles of the Amazon. And nothing but seafood. And if you can't do that, then you're
going to die.
Yeah. I'm like, look, there's things that we can all do to live in this modern world that we live in, some more than others, depending on how weak they are to non-native EMF and but still nonetheless, I'm not saying that you should, everything in your house should be smart, broadcasting signals all the time, and you should live next to a cell phone tower, because that's going to have some negative implications on a person's health.
Maybe. There's really not a lot of proof, but we'll see. I mean,
I digress. I disagree with you on
that. The research develops, we'll see. There's a lot of electromagnetic signaling that happens in your body. Every time your heart beats, you produce an electromagnetic field. And so I think that, just having your heart...
Yes, but that is well different than having a 4G cell phone next to your testicles when you walk, when there have been many studies that have shown to decrease sperm counts in vivo within humans
but that could just be heat as well.
That is a possibility too, but still nonetheless, though.
Essentially, when you look at an energy system, there's a lot of attenuation that goes on. So you look at you look at electrons and the way they function. It's not just all, not all of it is absorbed, right? So the stuff that isn't used as energy a lot of times is given off as heat, and so it heats up that general area, and then it's going to lead to lower sperm count. Doesn't necessarily mean that the radio waves are literally going and killing the sperm cells. But again, we'll see what happens. We'll see who's right in the end.
So pretty much you're telling me that you are a shill paid off by Ajit Pal in the FCC. That's what you're telling me, Jason.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll go off on a tangent here since we're getting towards the end of the show. I am concerned about 5G. And these 5G systems are coming out, I think, in 6 cities or something.
They're already out.
Okay. And I am concerned about the 5G, and there's something that people don't understand is that the systems that we use to detect, to do our weather tracking, hurricane tracking, is very close to infrared and 5G. And so I predict that there's going to be interference between our technologies to track hurricanes and get our early warning detection from hurricanes and the implementation of 5G. And look, I don't know, I love technology. I've got a lot of gadgets and stuff. It's I've always got the newest phone and, the newest thing and whatever. But 4G is, for me, when I'm out and about and I'm not on Wi-Fi, 4G is pretty fast. I mean, it's fast enough for what I'm doing when I'm not on Wi-Fi. Do you really need, how fast do you really need to be?
Need that virtual reality. Need to be able to stream live 4K to your phone. Get it in your retinas.
Yeah, get in, when you're just out and about, do that when you're on a Wi-Fi connection. You don't need that 24/7, And so we might be shortchanging some people that aren't getting their early warning for, a hurricane's coming, because somebody wants 4K instead of 1080p. They just want a little high resolution YouTube video when they're watching it on the train or something like that. It's okay, how many phones are even displaying in 4K right now anyway? 1080p on a phone screen is probably going to be good enough for you for video. You could probably not even tell the difference between the two. Anyway, that's what I'm concerned about, is more real world practical things and not these hypothetical stuff that no one has proven and, just kind of preaches on about, an item. And
so we learned today, folks, if you're listening to the podcast, that Jason is pro Bill Melinda Gates in the New World Order's agenda, as well as pro FCC that non-native EMF is safe. You've heard it here first, folks, as Alex Jones would say. But anyway, nonetheless, what about if someone has APOE4 or APO polymorphism? What can they do?
Okay, so you're going to need probably a higher fat diet, in my opinion, if you have that genotype.
Healthy fats. You don't want to guzzle canola and soybean oil.
No, you don't. But you're going to want to, and it's also the E4 variant is late onset sporadic Alzheimer's disease. So we're talking about way late in life and with that particular isoform. So
I thought APOE4 lowers the age of onset.
No. It's the largest known genetic risk factor for late onset sporadic Alzheimer's disease.
Okay.
But anyway, they tend to have lower cholesterol levels, people with APOE4, because they don't have the right lipid packets transports, or rather the receptors, not the transports. But they tend to have higher buildup of the peptide beta amyloid. So I don't know, like you need to go into your genetic data also, and you need to look at both of your alleles, because you have 2 copies of each gene. And so the total population, I think, is like maybe 12% of people have the E4 variant. Well, a lot of these people only have it on one gene, and they might have a save on the other gene. And that's like 50 to 60% of people. So they're good to go. If you've got that. But if you've got both alleles that have the E4 variant, then it might increase your risk between, probably like 10 to 30 times by the time you hit 75 of reaching Alzheimer's disease. So, again, since your cholesterol levels are lower, you need to definitely have more fat in your diet. I think you also need more exercise. You need to be consuming probably more calories, and just trying to raise your metabolism a little bit as much as possible. And then all the other things would apply to, with sleep and diet and circadian rhythm and all that good stuff.
So one last thing too is there has been an implication of sauroplasm and ferritin transportation issues of sauroplasm being the copper transporting protein and ferritin being the iron transporting protein in people with Alzheimer's disease as well. That's been implicated. So you might want to look into the work of Morley Robbins for mineral rebalancing as far as that is concerned. But
yeah, I'm just going to say that. I don't believe that. I think
I don't think it's a cause. I think it's a symptom.
I think it's a big marketing thing, because they get you to do these like, what do they call it? These like hair mineral tests and all these things that are just totally bunk, and they'll send you down a huge rabbit hole of, they're basically selling you all these tests and like, oh, we need to do this and we need to do that. And,
okay, then Jason, I have an N=1 for hair testing because I used to think it was bunk too. Do you want to hear my story?
Okay, we'll hear your anecdote.
Years ago, I had a friend of mine who purchased 2 hair mineral analysis tests for me. I cut my hair in 2 different locations. I mailed it from 2 different locations to use 2 different names. I used 2 different answered the questionnaires both differently. Okay, and they both came back almost identical one another with the results. I had elevated nickel because I had a partial stainless steel retainer still in my mouth, and I used a lot of stainless steel cookware, which that would have made sense, as well as low vitamin B12 and low lithium, which were both correlational to the H. pylori dysbiosis that you had told me at that time that I had, but still not believe that I had it during that time period. And so explain that.
Well, I don't disagree that you're not going to get the same result with the same test. My idea is that the results that you're getting from all of the tests are inaccurate, or they don't paint an accurate picture of the minerals and micronutrients in your body. The same thing, I think, with the saliva tests and a lot of this other garbage that, people will be happy to charge you, $600 a test for or whatever, and make you do it, I don't know, up to 20 different tests. That's a lot of money coming in for something that's not as accurate as like a micronutrient blood test or something that you'd get through like a SpectraCell or whatever.
I understand as far as nutrients. I do like SpectraCell, don't get me wrong. As far as mineral composition, SpectraCell is better than hair mineral. But I think for toxic metals, hair mineral is better in blood, at least in my opinion. You and I could disagree on that. I've seen it time and time again be correct in people who have had mercury amalgams and their mercury excretion through their hair be quite high. But it's the same with when you're talking about the saliva test and hormones. There are many studies of salivary cortisol levels being more accurate in Japan than blood cortisol levels and determination of adrenal issues and HPATG access issues as well. So I do think it is necessary, but there are a lot of scam testing out there that are scams, like live blood cell analysis and kinesiology and stuff like that.
So how do you know which test is more accurate? If you've got a blood test saying this and you've got a hair test saying this, how do you know which one is accurate?
Well, as far as what you talk about, as far as like mercury within the blood and mercury being expressed in the hair,
or any test, how do you know the efficacy of a test, or I guess the accuracy of a test rather, not the efficacy, the accuracy of a test? How do you know if one test is more accurate than another?
That's impossible to gauge on any test.
Well,
That's the problem with SIBO testing currently, with breath testing and gingival aspiration, which is considered the gold standard, that has even issues, or any testing has flaws, Jason.
Okay. Well, let's consider this for a second. Let's say I bought some cooking thermometers, right? Because I'm going to do some. I'm getting into what are those people that like make chocolates and stuff? You know,
there's more variance between the two difference of a cooking thermometer. To go ahead and interrupt you, there are way more variants involved with testing than just the temperature in and of itself and the accuracy of a scientific device.
Well, I'm just using this as an example.
Too simplistic.
I go onto Amazon and I buy 3 different thermometers. I buy one of those infrared guns, you know, that can measure the surface level. I buy one of those induction thermometers where I just stick it into the thing, and then I buy one of those wireless things, you know, one of those wireless thermometers. And all 3 thermometers are giving me a different readout of how hot the chocolate is. And I got to be very specific with this temperature because it's got to cool down to a certain thing, you know, in order to create that hardened shell and that glossy look, you know, that all the high-end chocolate companies or the chocolate makers use. And so I got to be really specific with the temperature. So how do I know which one's right?
You don't.
Well, you look at the result, right? And so you say, well, which one am I getting the best chocolate with out of these 3 thermometers?
Because all of them are going to have a margin of error. Yeah, I agree with you on that. So I've seen hair testing for heavy metal analysis be correct way more often than I've seen it not be correct.
As opposed to blood, opposed to the blood test?
As opposed to blood, yes. Once a person starts mercury chelation, even though if their blood is low but their hair is high and they have all the mercury amalgams taken out, and they start seeing good results using the Andrew Cutler protocol of DMSA first for 3 months and then ALA afterwards, I've seen remarkable improvements of people who didn't think they were mercury toxic because their blood test results were normal or within range.
Okay. Well, I mean, if it's working for them, that's great. I would say in general, though, in medicine, when you do a blood test, you're getting like a snapshot of exactly what's happening right now.
Well, it depends. Are we talking serum? Are we talking RBC? Some people have a greater amount of RBC turnover, which means that RBC will even show false amounts sometimes. Like, what are we talking about here, man? Like, you're comparing apples to oranges. All tests have flaws. You just have to look at the person as a whole and determine whether or not the test results are applicable to them or not. And conventional medicine has a horrible track record of doing that. For example, if you have a person where all their thyroid markers look in range, but they show all the symptoms of subclinical hypothyroidism, then what would you rather do? Try to tackle the subclinical hypothyroidism to see if they improve, or just leave it alone and then continue to suffer with subclinical hypothyroidism? Because conventional medicine is way more often going to do something like that, Jason. It's because everything looks on paper and the accepted ranges and the accepted value.
Well, with a lot of thyroid testing, though, they're only really looking at T3, T4. They're not looking at the RT3s. There's like a lot of different thyroid things. And if you look at the big picture, if you look at everything, you should be able to get enough data to see what's going on. What you don't want to do is take somebody who's maybe they're having a lot of the same symptoms, but maybe they have something else going on instead. And you start giving them thyroid hormone because maybe it could be bad for their heart. It increases like heart output.
No, of course, but you can start giving them iodine with selenium, and most of the time that seems to work a lot better.
Well, that's definitely a lot safer than just giving them, ThyroShield or whatever. But the point I was trying to make is that different tests show you different things. So a hair follicle test is going to show you more of a long-term pattern, and a blood test is going to show you more of a snapshot of what's going on right now. So if I go into the doctor's office and, it's like, I hate the doctor. I hate going in there. I hate being poked with a needle. Well, your cholesterol is probably going to be a little higher because you're going to be a little stressed out.
Yes.
Okay. So every time you go in to get your blood drawn, your cholesterol is a little high. Well, that may not be high. It just maybe, you're a little stressed out because you couldn't eat breakfast that morning and, you had to go into the doctor, you had to fast and all this other stuff. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's what your cholesterol values are going to be like on a day-to-day. So I think there are some advantages to doing the blood work over the hair follicle tests. I think the hair follicle test tends to show you like, well, this might have been what's going on for the last month. And the blood tests are going to be like, well, this is what's going on this very second of today. And so again, the proof is going to be in the treatment protocol for that specific patient, that specific thing, like which treatment tends to go off. Now, my argument is that when companies are using hair follicle tests, since it's over a period of a month, they're going to end up with more positive data because it's a long-term thing. And so like if you had a couple days where, your nickel was a little higher, you had this a little higher, they're going to be able to sell you some more packages that way, which is why they use that. It's also when a lot of these people are doing this over the mail, and there are regulations involving transporting blood and stuff like that, whereas there's none with hair, so they tend to use that. So I think a lot of that, in my opinion, is marketing with the saliva stuff and the hair stuff.
They do have male blood spot testing.
Yeah, they do, but it's bunk. And actually, that's one thing. I spent a lot of money on this thing. They had this huge. Who was that gal in Silicon Valley who raised tons of money? I mean, she was like a billionaire. And then it turned out that all of her research that she was doing was completely bunk, but she was doing like a mass spec on blood drop stuff where it's like, oh, we can get you don't have to take an entire vial of blood anymore. You can just take a little prick and do this thing. What was her name? Like Heather Hine or something like that. Do you know who I'm talking about? Does this ring a bell?
I know who you're talking about, but I can't replace the name.
Yeah, I can't remember her name either. We'll look her up and put her in the show notes. But anyway, like before she was even doing that, I invested in a company that was supposed to be doing this, and they had this whole racket in this presentation of like, yeah, we're doing this blood spot test, and you prick your finger and you put on the card. And John, I lost, I lost my shirt in that. I will never see a dime of that money that I invested ever again. And it just looked really good on paper. And they claimed that they had good equipment. And then they just kept like all of their company newsletters kept coming out and saying like, oh, our stuff works, trust us. But we're having just a problem with the FDA, getting it cleared through the FDA. And so I sent them a thing and I was like, hey, why don't you do this in another country where they don't have those restrictions and do it over email? And they're like, oh, yeah, we're looking into that. And like, don't look into it. Just do it. Just set up an office in like, I don't know, someplace where they don't have as high a regulation and just do it that way. And, and just email people the results. It's completely international, whatever. And they're like, yeah, we'll definitely do that. And after like a few years of this, it was obvious that it was a scam. And eventually we just stopped getting emails and they were gone. And so
I'm sorry, Jason.
Well, no, I mean, it happens, if you invest in stuff, most of the time, I would say it turns out that it's not going to pan out. So don't invest if you don't have money to lose. But like the point I'm trying to make is that blood spot testing is not really a thing. So don't waste your money on it because there's a lot of scammers out there. It's been documented now that there are people doing it, and it's a complete scam. So anyway, this has been a long podcast. I think we should probably end it here on on that note, be careful. Don't get scammed. Do the big things first, guys. Get your sleep, get your exercise, good diet. Make sure your gut's functioning properly.
Get sun.
Yeah, for sure. Manage your stress. Those are the big things. Those are also the things that most people don't do, and they don't want to do. They want something. They want a pill to take.
They want a pill.
They want some quick thing, and it's like, you know what? Yeah, it might sound daunting to some people. It's like, oh, I got to start doing all this stuff differently. Yeah, but it's not really that bad. It's not really that bad to eat more salads. It's not really that bad to go to bed on time. To wake up on time. It's not really that bad to go to the gym every once in a while. I mean,
it's not really that bad to get sun, when you can, when the weather's permitting. I'm not saying hours and hours and hours in the sun, but
right.
Getting any is better than nothing.
So one of the things that we offer with Fix Your Gut is coaching services, and our coaching services are not a replacement for a doctor's visit. They're not a replacement for standard medical treatment. But one of the things that we're able to do is we work with people on solutions on how to get these, your life in the right shape, where you can exercise and eat right and sleep. And, and a big thing with coaching is just being able to provide that accountability to where we make sure you're doing what you're supposed to. And if you're not, on the next coaching call, we're going to talk about what went wrong and all this other stuff. So, you don't have to do this on your own. You don't have to do it all by yourself. Get a coach. It doesn't have to be John or I. It could be somebody else. You could have one of your friends coach you or whatever, and just pick it up. It makes it so much easier if you've got somebody, and if you got an issue and you need to make some lifestyle changes, if you've got a coach and you got somebody working with you. So, check out our webpage if you'd like to hire John or I to help you out. Otherwise, there's a lot of other people out there that can pretty much do the same thing. So hope you enjoyed the podcast, and we look forward to putting another one out soon.
Take care, everybody.